The Beatles released 214 songs according to the official canon, even counting the recent Now and Then. And within that list, all 4 members of the band are present in one way or another in 87% of the songs. But what about that 13%? What happened? Why are 1, 2, or even 3 members of the band absent from a song? Whether for personal reasons, artistic reasons, fights, or accidents, there are almost 30 songs, and some of them very famous, in which 1 or more Beatles are absent. And in today's video, we will review in chronological order each song and their reasons for not having the full lineup of the band. The first time the Beatles were not involved in a song was on Yesterday in 1965. The story of the song is already well known. McCartney dreamt it one night and spent several months trying to trace the origins of the melody, but without finding a trace, he decided to record it for the band. On 14th of June 1965, when it was time to start McCartney's song, the Beatles for the first time stepped aside. I took the song to the band, and although we did sometimes play it as a 4-piece in concert, for the recording Ringo said, "I don't think I can really drum on that." George added, "Well, I'm not sure I can put much guitar on it either." And then John said, "I can't think of anything. I think you should just do it by yourself. It's really a solo song." Now this was kind of a big deal at the time, because we'd never recorded like that before. It had always been the band. Paul McCartney said for his book The Lyrics, "Despite trying to record Yesterday with John Lennon on the Hammond organ, the end result ended up pushing McCartney to record it alone." George Martin then set about writing the string score for the song, in which Tony Gilbert, Sidney Sax, Kenneth Essexy, and Francesc Gabarro ended up recording the iconic Beatles track with Paul.
All the lonely people, where do they all come from?
As with Yesterday, McCartney had no lyrics at first, and it wasn't until he saw the name Rigby in a Bristol shop that the song began to forge its identity. Then there were disputes with Lennon over the percentage of authorship of the lyrics, and recording began in April 1966. The cut, inspired by the music of Bernard Herrmann, meant that Ringo's appearance was not necessary. Dropping a member due to the needs of a song would become increasingly common in the Beatles, and here, only John, George, and Paul worked on the vocal part of the song. Following the sitar motif on Norwegian Wood, This Bird Has Flown, Love You Too was the Beatles' first full attempt at recording a piece of music in the classical Indian style. I wrote Love You Too on the sitar, because the sitar sounded so nice and my interest was getting deeper all the time. I wanted to write a tune that was specifically for the sitar. Also, it had a tabla part, and that was the first time we used a tabla player, said Harrison, who downplayed the contributions of his bandmates by inviting the Asian Music Circle to record the track. Only Paul and Ringo were invited to the session, to which they did not contribute much. She Said was recorded when the Beatles realized they were 1 song short for the Revolver album. In a hectic 9-hour session on 21st June 1966, during which the majority of the album's mono and stereo mixes were also done, they rehearsed the song more than 25 times and then recorded 3 takes of the rhythm track. However, due to an argument over the musical arrangement of the song, Paul McCartney left the studio during the recordings. It was the first time that Paul McCartney did not play on a Beatles record. His place was taken by George Harrison, and a few more bass parts played on an organ were added into the final recording. The Beatles began recording For No One on 9th of May 1966. 10 takes of the rhythm track were recorded, with Paul McCartney on Steinway grand piano and Ringo Starr on drums. The 10th take was selected as the best, and then McCartney overdubbed a harpsichord and Starr added maracas, hi-hat, and tambourine. John and George were not required, and instead Alan Civil, who was the principal trumpet player in the Philharmonia Orchestra, played the French horn. More changes would come in the Sgt. Pepper's era, and much like previous instances of this video, She's Leaving Home does not include any musical instruments played by the Beatles. It features only Paul and John in a beautiful vocal performance. Once again dispensing with his bandmates due to their apathy towards his songs, George Harrison did this song on his own for the Sgt. Pepper's. There was not much time left, as the band and George Martin had already rejected Only a Northern Song as a possible contribution for the album. So in order not to be left out, he did this song where only he and Neil Aspinall played while Indian musicians played traditional instruments. Days later, George Martin added the orchestral part of the song. By 1968, which was to be the year in which the Beatles worked most separately, came The Inner Light. Its lyrics, based on the Taoist Guide to Living Tao Te Ching, was written by George Harrison and first released as the B-side of Lady Madonna. The song came about as part of the sessions for Wonderwall, the soundtrack of the same name that Harrison was commissioned to write by director Joe Massot. When Harrison recorded his lead vocal, he needed some support from John and Paul to record it, as the song was above his usual range and made him a little insecure. But according to a tape operator, McCartney told Harrison, "You should give it a go, don't worry, it's fine." So, encouraged by his bandmates and backed by them on backing vocals, the song was finished on 8 February 1968. The White Album sessions were plagued by problems and differences between the band members, and while rehearsing back in the USSR on 22 August 1968, Ringo Starr got fed up with McCartney's criticism of his drumming on the song and the general bad atmosphere and left the band. The other Beatles continued with the session, and Paul McCartney played the drums on the recording we all know. Here, Paul McCartney plays drums again. Starr returned after repeated requests from his bandmates and found his drum kit decorated with red, white, and blue flowers as a welcome gift from George Harrison. Same case, where the involvement of 3 Beatles was not necessary. The group's efforts for their double album would often result in them working in different studios. At the time, John Lennon and Ringo Starr were working on other songs for the album, while George Harrison was on holiday in Greece. Paul McCartney did lead vocals, backing vocals, acoustic guitar, kick drum, and other percussion. Martha My Dear was recorded over 2 days at Trident Studios in Soho, London, which had an 8-track recorder, a first for the Beatles, who normally worked with 4. McCartney recorded vocals and piano first, and between 9 p.m. and midnight, 14 session musicians added brass and string parts. George Martin had written the score to a demo previously recorded by McCartney, and George Harrison and Ringo Starr also played on the recording. Paul McCartney recorded Blackbird solo on 11 June 1968, with only a guitar accompaniment. It was recorded in Studio 2 at Abbey Road, while John Lennon worked on Revolution 9 in Studio 3 next door. Ringo Starr's first recorded composition, Don't Pass Me By, was written several years before its 1968 release on the White Album. Don't Pass Me By was mentioned by the band on 14th of July 1964 during an introduction to And I Love Her for the first edition of the BBC radio music series Top Gear. The fact that Don't Pass Me By was ignored until 1968 speaks volumes about the Beatles' willingness to record any available material after their trip to India. The recording of Don't Pass Me By began on 5th of June 1968. 3 takes of the rhythm track were recorded. Recorded during the latter stages of work on the White Album, Why Don't We Do It in the Road, was an impromptu recording by Paul McCartney with the assistance of Ringo Starr. The song was recorded while John Lennon and George Harrison were working on other songs. Lennon later described McCartney's decision as painful, explaining that it represented the fragmented way in which the members of the group had taken to recording songs in 1968. That's Paul. He even recorded it by himself in another room. That's how it was getting in those days. We came in and he'd made the whole record. Him drumming, him playing the piano, him singing. But he couldn't. Maybe he couldn't make the break from the Beatles. I don't know what it was, I enjoyed the track. Still, I can't speak for George, but I was always hurt when Paul would knock something off without involving us. But that's just the way it was then, said John Lennon in 1980. Although it was completed in only 2 days, the Beatles needed 67 takes to make this song. George Harrison did not take part in the recording, starting at 7 p.m. on 16 September 1968 and finishing at 3 a.m. the following day. Paul McCartney, John Lennon, and Ringo Starr recorded the song, plus a series of improvisations as the session progressed. Take 65 of I Will was the best version, and the following day, McCartney overdubbed backing vocals. He also sang a bass part. Julia was written by John Lennon for his mother, who died in a car accident in 1958. It is Lennon's only solo recording in the Beatles canon. The Beatles had recorded a demo of Julia on the Escher demos, and although it is very similar to the studio version, it appears to contain vocal contributions from other members of the group and improvised whistles that were eventually dropped. While John and Ringo were working on Yer Blues, Mother Nature's Son was recorded in simultaneous during a troubled period for the Beatles. Paul McCartney worked mostly alone on the song. Although the band could contribute to the track, in the end, Paul ended up taking over several instruments and no other Beatles appear on the recording. George Harrison on vocals and acoustic guitars, Paul McCartney on backing vocals, Hammond organ and bass, Ringo Starr on drums, and Chris Thomas on piano. The sessions ended on 9 October 1968, the birthday of John Lennon, who was not present. The other Beatles and George Martin persuaded Lennon not to include Revolution 9 on the White Album without success. Concerned about the public perception of the group, the song ended up being worked on by John, George, and Yoko alone. And although Paul McCartney was in New York while it was being recorded, he defended himself against Lennon's attacks on his individualism by saying, "Anyway, he did the same with Revolution 9. He went off and made that without me. No one ever says that. John is the nice guy and I'm the bastard. It gets repeated all the time." Ringo does this song alone. And although the song began to be recorded with John on guitar, after several days he was dropped and did not end up in the final version. The song was written in the days immediately following Lennon and Ono's wedding on 20th of March 1969, and was recorded in a single day by Lennon and Paul McCartney alone. At the time, Ringo Starr was filming The Magic Christian, and George Harrison was on holiday. It was a nice exercise in the magic that John and Paul could still have together. From the great Abbey Road, because, thanks to its cut, didn't need percussion, and being an all-vocal track, it didn't need Ringo on backing vocals either, producing a beautiful exercise in harmonies between John, George, and Paul. During the recording of the same album, Abbey Road, the Beatles worked incomplete on some songs due to John Lennon's accident. The recording of Golden Slumbers, Carry That Weight began while John was in hospital recovering from a car accident in Scotland. George Harrison played bass and Ringo Starr was on drums. Her Majesty is the shortest song in the Beatles' repertoire and was not featured on the original Abbey Road editions. The song was recorded in 3 takes on July of 1969, with Paul McCartney singing live with his acoustic guitar before the rest of the band began work on Golden Slumbers and Carry That Weight. Maxwell's Silver Hammer was a song full of problems because it was so heavy and repetitive. The band hated it. They had been working on it for months since the Get Back sessions earlier in the year and returned to it for the Abbey Road recordings. It was recorded over 3 days while John Lennon and Yoko Ono were recovering from a car accident in Scotland. However, they both attended the Abbey Road sessions. Ringo hated it. George hated it, and Lennon hated it too, saying, "He made us do it 100 million times." John Lennon was not involved in one of the Beatles' most famous songs. He was still recovering from his car accident at the time of the first sessions, and later George Harrison largely completed the song alone. Although worked on by the Beatles since the Get Back sessions in January 1969, this was the last song recorded by the Beatles. On 3rd of January 1970, John Lennon was on holiday in Denmark and had virtually left the group anyway months earlier, so only Harrison, McCartney, and Starr attended the session. Ringo Starr played drums on the final session, with 27 string players and 6 brass players, providing the wall of sound that took Harrison's song from a simple blues waltz to something much more elaborate. At the end, Paul isn't present in 5 songs. John isn't present in 18 songs. George isn't present in 12 songs. And Ringo isn't present in 15 songs. Well, that's it for today. There are a few more cases of unofficial songs, bootlegs, and incomplete works that may share similar characteristics to this video. Write us down here your impressions, and we will gladly read them. Thanks for watching. Subscribe if you haven't already, and, well, that's all for now. This is Music Box.